Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio, audio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the notion that's doing the rounds and has been for a while, but it seems to have picked up pace recently about how the British Empire, the only reason white people in the British Empire became rich was because of slaves. If it wasn't for slaves and colonial exploitation and Britain would have been a dirt poor basket case country, just like the worst examples of in Africa today. It was only slaves that made them rich. Exploitation, capitalist. They were Nazis. They were Hitler. So this is the nonsense and the idiocy that's doing the rounds, encouraged by the globalist cabal machine as part of denigrating the West and denigrating white people and undermining the white institutions and white society, something that they're doing very successfully, by the way. They've even managed to co-opt our own political representatives into doing it. So our own straight white male political representatives are taking white taxpayer dollars and spending as much as they can to spread hatred against their white fellow citizens. Has this ever happened in human history, for goodness sakes? Anyway, just coming back to this idea of slaves. Now, I was listening to a student in I suppose, a debating situation. It was a 19, 20-year-old girl, very low IQ, and she was saying, well, look, the slaves, this is, say, going to North America as an example, the slaves were free labor. And she said, well, if you don't have to pay your workers, and you can work them really hard, then that's more profit for you. Evil capitalism, Hitler, white supremacy, and so on. So her view was that the workers, the slaves, just magically appeared and worked for free and so on. So if you imagine today, as she extrapolates, if you don't have to pay your workers, then of course your profits will be high. All right, then. Well, let's run with that. Let's examine that now. I guess. Firstly, the claim is that only white people did slavery. Absolute, outright lie. Absolute, flat out lie. So we can move past that straight away. That white people fetched up into Africa and just started rando grabbing black people as slaves. Flat out lie. Absolute, flat out lie. The biggest business that the black people had in Africa was selling their fellow black Africans off to whoever wanted to buy them, which could be, by the way, another black tribe. It could be Arab slavers who were big players in the game around there and had been for a long time. And also from, say, the early 1500s, I guess, with the Portuguese and the Spanish. Coming to the ports along that western seaboard of Africa, or the northern half of West Africa, and buying slaves from black slavers. So the idea that white people were enslaving black, rando grabbing, absolute flat out lie. So we can move past that one. Now let's look at the free labor thing. Now the favourite lie, again, more lies, that's put about is that the black slaves were packed into the ships. This is the ships going to North America or the Caribbean. The slaves were packed into the ships, so they're like sardines, and nearly all of them died on the journey. So that's how terrible and evil it was, evil-wise, and this is simply not true. The cost of a ship and a crew and the payment that had to be made for the black slaves, the building of the port facilities, because all those port facilities and holding pens, that was all, the white people had to build that as part of the deal when they came there. Some of it was already in place in terms of in situ, but it was upgraded and built, as in like a fortified sort of position with cannons and stuff there. So the infrastructure was reasonably expensive, and then the ship would be expensive. These ships were expensive to build and maintain, and so now in order to turn a profit, the ship had to sell those slaves in North America or the Caribbean at a minimum, for example, at a minimum of $400 each. So now remember, slavery was going on all over Africa. Black people selling each other, Arab slaves doing it. The idea that only white people doing it is again flat out lie. So white people came quite late to the game, actually, in terms of slavery, or white people enslaving each other. Say the Irish raiders or the Viking raiders enslaving, the Welsh people from the, that sort of stuff was going on. But in terms of black-white slaves, then this was the now. So really, if you didn't get to the other end from Africa to America or the Caribbean, if you didn't get to the other end with a lot of slaves in good condition, not just alive and barely, but in good condition, and there were buyers that would exhaustively go through looking for skin blemishes. Did they have all their teeth, and were they fit and healthy? The slaves had to perform, physical acts like jumping and climbing and running, and they had to prove that they were in good physical condition, ready to start heavy physical work. If they couldn't, then so there were slaves were being virtually given away if they were in poor health. So you had to get to the other end with fit, healthy slaves ready to start work on these the plantations and so on. And now, if you had a fit slave that was in good condition, you could get $700-800. If you had one that was in condition, 300, 350, even then, But if you had a slave in poor condition, you'd be getting, $25, $50. And then, even then, the buyer had to be reasonably confident they could, through better diet or medical care, they could return the slave to at least sufficient health to do the heavy work. So this idea that slaves were mistreated horribly, they were starved and beaten, and they arrived emaciated, no, an absolute flat out lie. So you had to, and if you packed them in like sardines and didn't feed them or this sort of thing, then you wouldn't arrive at the other end with a cargo and the slaves in good condition. It just wouldn't happen. So you had to have, if you picked up, for example, if you picked up 100, so this is in Africa to go to again the Americas, if you picked up 100 slaves, you had to get $500 a piece to break even. And so these are the sort of economics that applied, as crude and vulgar as we would see it today. But the difference between being a slave and being an indentured servant, a white servant to a white, the difference was you could barely see daylight between the two. So the idea that it was something uniquely racist, again, flat out lie. So okay, so the slave gets to the plantation owner in the Americas, and the plantation, if it's someone fit and ready to start hard work straight away, the plantation owners paid $800. That was a shitload of money back in the day. Bear in mind that hiring a white worker you'd pay something like 75 cents a day. So that it gives you, so you've got 3 to 4 years of work out of somebody. In this case, the slave will be the equivalent of 3 to 4 years of a white guy working for you that speaks English, that can receive instructions. If they can read the Bible, they'll be able to receive written instructions. So whereas the black slave can't speak English, got to be taught English, and the white guy, 75 cents a day, is feeding himself and looking after himself. The slave isn't. You've got to pay for the slave, the accommodation, and so on. So now we come to the next level, where the slaves were given terrible conditions. They were, given the worst possible accommodation, absolute crap food, and beaten to a pulp every day. Again, simply not true. Flat out lie. If you've got a workforce, be it slaves or not, if you've got a workforce and they're out there doing the the hard yards and the heavy lifting, and you know and some of the farm work it's heavy work. So you need them in good condition to do that work. If you're beating them every day, they can't do the work. If you're feeding them shit food, they can't do the work. You know, they'll fatigue quickly and so on. If you give them crap accommodation where they're unclothed and badly fed, and there are terrible drafts coming, then they're going to get sick and they're going to die. And in those days, if you got something like a chill and pneumonia, so it could be fatal. So as a farmer, and remember, you've already paid $800. Well, why would you then risk that $800 as being a total waste by letting your slaves or your workers, letting them get sick and die? I mean, you just plain wouldn't do it. So you'd provide the medical care and you'd provide a good diet. And so it's a dirt floor, a shack with just beds made of straw and a table and a chair or something. The basics. So let's even assume it was that. It's way better than whatever they had in Africa. So the idea that they were moving down market here, again, flat out lie. Now the fact was that those huts were actually quite well maintained. Again, they had fires in them, they had stoves in them, they had all sorts of things in them that you wouldn't get in a hut in Africa, so or an accommodation in Africa. So these people had a much higher standard of living than they had in Africa, and the farmer was providing the plantation owner was providing the food. Now, when you look at it as mealy, or whatever you look at, the food had to be good enough to keep the workers in a good state of health. Now, the next thing that was an issue was if you've got to pay so much to have to buy slaves from the slavers, it makes much more sense if your slaves procreate, and then you don't have to lay out that kind. Now, if you want to buy an unfit slave that can't work, sure, it's cheap. But if you want to buy a fit, healthy, ready to do the hard work slave, it's $800 more. But if you encourage procreation, and you don't have to pay that sort of money. I mean, you have to wait till the child becomes old enough to do work. So, but in those days, white kids would be working on the farms at 8, 9, 10 years old. It wasn't unusual. So need to put that in some perspective as well. So was the workforce free? You've got to supply all the food, medical care, clothing, accommodation, sanitation. All that's at the plantation owner's expense. The procreation, you've got to bring, the children have to stay alive long enough to be able to become workers. All that again is at the plant. So it wasn't free at all. So that the white guy you could employ at 75 cents an hour or a day, that guy had to meet all his own expenses. If he lived on the farm, for example, the white worker, if he lived on the farm, then and you gave him food and accommodation, then he got a much lesser rate per day. So that needs to be considered as well. So it certainly wasn't free. The workers weren't free. Far from it. And there was a certain expense that was reasonably high by any measure. Now, if you had a larger workforce, for example, you had an even number, you had 100 slaves, then you could have big communal cooking pots, and that would be enough food to everybody. So you could realise that economies, there. But so the reality is the slaves weren't free; they were expensive to acquire, and there was a considerable expense in looking after them and keeping them in a state of health where they could do the work, and where the women and the men were healthy enough to procreate. This too was important. People are emaciated; they can't procreate. So all these are, but none of these issues were certainly the debates and the considerations and the papers and the ravings that I've seen by Western university kids. They don't seem to consider any of that. They don't seem to even be aware of it. They don't seem to give a shit about it. As far as it was all free labor, capitalist, Hitler, Nazi, white supremacy. What else do you need to know? So the facts and the realities are really just ignored, completely ignored. The narrative is all that matters, and the facts, well, hey, who cares about them? So now the idea of personal ownership, that is, people owning slaves, that was sort of how the world was. The only reason that black people became the desired workforce in the Americas, this includes the Caribbean or even South America for that matter. The only reason was that it was a labor exchange sort of concept. The population of Portugal was tiny. Even if their entire population had moved to Brazil, that there wouldn't have been enough people to run the plantations, which was extremely labor intensive at the time, even is today to a large extent. So the only source of labor was where there were surplus populations, which were black. If you looked around the world, certainly within access to Europe, the only surplus populations, because Europe was relatively sparsely populated at the time. We need to remember. The population of England was like 3 million or something. So this idea of the white people could have done the work, but instead they chose the way. It wasn't like that way. The only surplus population in striking distance of Europe was the black population of Africa, and there were, even then, as there very much are today, considerable surplus populations. Remember, the blacks were all enslaving each other. So this is not like it's a white thing. And the other thing, and this was really the one that swung it, was that the black people were resistant to not only white man's diseases, things like smallpox and cholera, that sort of stuff, but they were also resistant to the diseases that you'd find in swamps and so on, or far more resistant than white people were. So where they tried white people in the swamps and the bayous doing the work, the white people died like flies, whereas the black people, the black workers, slaves in this case, they were highly resistant to that, or certainly far more so than white people were. So now, had the black people died like flies, in those areas, then they wouldn't have been. So what would be the point? Seriously, what would be the point? But because they were resistant of white man's and those swamp type diseases, they were the perfect workers, as they were hardy enough to survive in those sort of environments and to do the heavy work that is part of any farm and any plantation anywhere in the world. So these are the issues. Now, when you look at this in wider context, so why is there such a carry on about colonialism and this and slavery, and slavery is what made the white people rich? I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was what made the white countries rich was technical innovation and the Industrial Revolution and the scientific inventions. That if you look at all the countries that adopted the scientific method, Germany, Britain, and that sort of thing, all the countries adopted the scientific method. This was following the Renaissance, of course. Then they all became rich. And the countries that did not follow the scientific method stayed poor, even became poorer for that matter. So that's the issue. Nothing to do with slavery. And if you look at the cost of acquiring slaves and then keeping them, remember, all food, accommodation, clothing, medical care, everything is paid for by the plantation owner. It wasn't cheap. Now, in a cost analysis, if it cost you 75 cents a day to hire a white worker who can speak English and receive written instructions and so on, then it was approximately the same cost to acquire and maintain slaves during those times. So we really need so to say that that's where the riches or the profits came from. This is the plantation and farming profits came from slavery. That's simply not true, and it won't stand up even to a modicum of scrutiny. You've been with Tassos today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.